Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Joe Treasure. Joe is a narrative fiction writer and novelist, as well as a freelance editor and writing coach. Joe has 3 published novels to his credit: The Male Gaze, Besotted, and The Book of Air. Joe is presently writing his memoir. He dabbles in poetry and in life writing. Joe Treasure, it's a pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you, Howard. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Now, for our listeners, the beauty of technology, Joe is in the beautiful UK. I am here in Las Vegas. Beautiful here as well. And that's what I love about technology is I get to have wonderful conversations with some creative and wonderful people halfway around the world. So I hope, Joe, life is good there for you and your loved ones in the UK.
It's great. Thanks, Howard. I'm sitting here in our apartment in what is right now very sunny South London.
Wow. I was going to ask you, it looks like it's very bright light coming in, and that means I was going to ask you, is it sunny in London? I don't recall that.
Yeah, right. It's not warm today. It's a decent February, March temperature, but the sun is shining.
Fantastic. Well, definitely no, even in February and March, it's great to get, anytime you're in London, anytime for that matter, it's great to get out. So I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Joe, I would love if you could, I want to talk really about the work that you're doing, because there's so much creativity involved in your writing and helping others with their writing. Before we kind of dive in, I'd love if you could just paint a brief picture about your background and what has led you into this creative writing field and the variations or tangents you've taken, because I think our listeners would enjoy hearing that story.
Well, I might say something later on about my early life because it will connect with my current project of life writing. But I sort of stumbled into a high school teaching job with an English degree and discovered I liked teaching. I didn't really have a passion to do it. It was a job that came up. I needed to earn a living. And early on, I got bounced into directing a school play. Already overworked and way out of my depth. And I sort of learnt on the job about how to pull together a school play, which is a sort of a complicated thing to do. And that became a big thing for me. So over the next 20 years, I directed dozens of plays and created a drama program, put on an annual festival of drama where kids would write their own plays or they would direct plays, or young, inexperienced teachers who wanted to have a go could put on a one-act play and get supervision doing it. So that was a great thing. And I learned a lot about the sort of practical aspects of the theatre. But then, of course, always at the heart of it was my interest in literature. So that was very important.
So I'm curious, with the helping in the production of plays, working with students and writing your own plays, and the fact that you stumbled into it, or you were asked to do this, and you already had your plate full, did you have a mentor, a guide, a go-to? Did you go to the library and say, how do I do this? How do you just get thrown into the deep end of the pool and figure out how to swim?
Yeah, this was an independent school. And British education, in any case, I should say, high school education in the independent sector, certainly when I began, not so true now, was extremely amateurish as a positive quality. There was a kind of an attachment to amateurishness. You did it for the love of it, of course, which is the root of the word amateur, but also you were largely untrained for what you did. There was that model of how you did things. So, and I was bounced into it in the sense that an older mentor said, let's direct a play together. You help me out and you'll see how it's done. And a couple of weeks into the project, he said, you seem to be doing fine by yourself. I'll leave it to you. this was not entirely helpful, but in the long term, I got pushed into doing it. I did learn mainly from simply doing it and working out the practicalities to do with how you would use lighting, music, it's a collaborative enterprise. So how do you negotiate with people to give their time voluntarily to help out, let's say, technically helping you create the scene, get the art department involved and so on. So I was learning multiple skills of that kind. The editing piece, of course, was crucial for me. I liked doing Shakespeare, partly because he has big casts. And so you involve lots of kids. And there's lots of scope for creativity. But also I was able to collaborate with the author. Because frankly, his plays are a bit long for the school purposes. And some of his jokes aren't funny. So what with one thing and another, I did a lot of undoubtedly, my first editing experience was cutting down a 3-hour Shakespeare play, maybe to 2 hours, or sometimes an hour, 40 minutes.
I'm curious what Mr. Shakespeare would have to say about all that, but knowing your body of work, he would have been happy. And it's like, wow, that is a great idea. Joe, I've got another curiosity question. I just moved from Chicago last year, and we used to have a lot of neighborhood theaters. They were little storefronts that had once been a drugstore, a sewing shop, something like that, and they got turned into these little theaters. What was the theater scene when you were writing these plays and producing them? Was it like they weren't in the Royal Albert Hall? I think that's it. Where were the settings for these plays?
So principally in school, and there was a school hall, and I worked out early that I needed to adapt the hall to bring the audience closer to the action. So we created a kind of theatre in the round, or what they would call in the theatre a thrust stage, pushed out into the middle of the audience. We created that kind of thing. We had tiered seating constructed. So over a number of years, I sort of worked out how to turn the school hall into our own space and claim more and more time, so that I ended up claiming the school hall for 2 weeks every term and saying it's ours for drama, and we'll take it over. But I also did performances in other spaces in school. So I did a promenade performance of a play, that's to say with the audience on their feet, of course, following the actors around, in the school library and going into the school chapel. And, so we made use of the spaces we had.
Do you have recollection of students or parents coming back to you years later and saying, wow, this was a fantastic time. I remember this, Mr. Treasurer, Dr. Treasurer, Professor Treasurer. I love this experience. You ever recall any of those statements?
Because they have happened from time to time, and of course I recall them vividly, Howard, because this is it's a very moving and exciting thing when years later somebody says, this was important to me. And there are a couple of a number of students who went on. One became an actor and a stand-up comedian and is still very successful in midlife and's got his own radio show in Wales. There's another one who became an actor, did a lot of BBC radio theatre, and now has a sort of a semi-permanent role as a character in Doctor Who. He is. I don't watch Doctor Who, but he is some really important alien who shows up from time to time. So this guy who acted in plays of mine, he now turns up at sci-fi conferences and conventions in his full alien gear.
Oh wow, that's interesting. So let's move farther ahead now. The next kind of a significant part of your journey as this creative writer, novelist. When did the novel start to take form for you? Because you wrote them pretty much one right after the other.
Well, as a teacher, I was occasionally writing poetry. Towards the end of my period of time as a teacher, I started writing a novel. Very slow progress because I didn't have the continuity of time to sit down and work on it. Whereas you can work on a sonnet in your head in spare moments, scribbling things down in a notebook. To write prose, you really have to be sort of having dedicated time and pay attention to it to make much progress. I stepped away from my career because I followed my wife, Lenny Wildflower, for her career from Britain back to her hometown, Los Angeles, where she just finished a PhD and she was looking for work. And so I was uprooted. I did some part-time teaching there, and that's when I started writing seriously. So I was well into my 40s and I wrote a novel. I sent it off to agents and I got what I would call encouraging rejections. So no, not simply a formal. Some of them you just get a formal rejection. Thank you for sending your work. It isn't for us, but we wish you all the best. That sort of formal. A few of them wrote, we're really interested in this and think perhaps it has potential. We won't take you on, but we hope you find the right place for it. And I took that as a bit more encouraging. I decided that I wanted to know more about writing, that I studied literature and I taught English, but I felt I didn't really know about how to write a novel from the inside rather than reading it and studying it from the outside. So I decided I should do an MA in creative writing. And I was in LA and American friends said, well, the best places, the three best places to do creative writing are in the States. And one of them is just up the road, UC Irvine. That's the place to go. But I sort of had a feeling that culturally, I needed a sort of British perspective on what I was writing in order to feel I was going to be challenged in the right way, both understood and critiqued effectively.
Sure.
I had that experience that British people sometimes do in America, particularly California, Los Angeles, of people saying, "Oh, I love your accent. You must be so intelligent." I mean, they maybe not put it quite in those terms, but there is an assumption, and I felt that forget that I'd be given too much leeway. I thought I may not be right about that, by the way, but I thought I'd be able to blag my way through an MA perhaps in California. I wanted to get back to London and have and that was a very interesting experience to study creative writing in London because it turned out to be an extremely diverse group of people. A young woman from Bangladesh, a number of Americans, a Canadian, somebody who'd spent most of his life in Europe. And it was an interesting group of people.
This begs the question. I mean, you definitely with this international flavor and, my perception of Americans, and being one myself, is we like to have the punchline like up front. We need to know exactly what's going to happen and then tell the story because we don't want surprises. We can't think 2 or 3 steps ahead. If we don't know it, we can't get through it. And so I'm making an assumption here. I could be wrong. I see our TV, our entertainment versus, I by the way, I'm watching season 7 of Endeavor right now, taking place in Oxford, which I love the English writing and the storytelling. Your audience who knows of you, knows of your books, where are they from? Are they globally? I mean, you've talked about a couple individuals were from other countries, women in Bangladesh, etc. Is your audience from other countries? Are they predominantly UK, US? Where are they from?
I would say predominantly UK and the United States, and perhaps Ireland. My books have not been translated except into Dutch, but randomly. That was an interesting experience being translated. But that's where it's the English-speaking North America and Britain. I have to say, Howard, about the sort of the American perspective. The perception from Britain is that America is a sort of dominant force in serious literary fiction. And the premier literary prize in Britain, which is the Man Booker Prize for Fiction, an annual prize every year for the best literary novel. A few years ago, they decided to open it up to America. And it was previously for novels published in the English language in Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, the Commonwealth countries, English-speaking countries, but explicitly excluded was the United States. And the assumption when they opened it up was, well, that's sunk it because it's just going to be won by Americans now. So we do have what we sometimes call a cultural cringe in relation to America. And then you move on to television. Well, American TV writing has transformed the medium. The subscription channels, HBO and so on, with series like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and so on. These are the sort of, early series that made people feel, well, I remember novel writing friends saying to me, what are novelists for now? Finally, television has worked out, create things of the substance, depth and length of novels. But anyway, there are different perspectives on this. But for me, the novel remains the form I'm most comfortable with.
Speaking of your novels, your first two, The Male Gaze, Besotted, and I have read Besotted. I was able to sit down in blocks of time. Usually for me, it's 20 to 30 minutes, and then I use reading to go to bed. Okay, but I found I could consume Besotted and got into the story and thoroughly enjoyed it. I am curious though about the Book of Air, and you were a man before your times, just given what we're going through right now. So tell us a little bit of, with COVID-19 for our listeners, tell us a little bit about the Book of Air. How did it come about, and what's your perspective? Because you've written this novel, and now you're actually living through a reality of a pandemic.
Yeah, and one thing about it is the impulse to write it is one thing that I find it very difficult to repeat myself. So writers, for example, particularly in genres who write sequels, who have let's say a detective character who appears in 20 novels, I'm at the other end of the scale. Once I've written a novel, I feel like I just can't do that again. So my first novel was set in Los Angeles, and I felt once I'd finished it that I'd said everything I had to say about Los Angeles, and I could not imagine writing another book about it. And then Besotted was another thing again, and delved somewhat in a very fictionalized form into my childhood. But I also, I felt as I progressed from one of those to the other, I was extending the length of the perspective. So I was everything in The Male Gaze took place within a few weeks from start to finish. With Besotted, I wanted to sort of it's got a kind of a 15-year perspective as the 30-year-olds look back on their teenage life. And I was very interested in these long perspectives. And the Book of Air, partly, I was thinking about centuries long perspectives. I was just wanting to extend that, but also just do something different. And I was intrigued by the idea of a society that organizes itself around a sacred text that, as we read it, we see is a kind of randomly chosen. And the whole seeds of the book, it grew out of that idea. So I was thinking, well, this society's got to be isolated. And so I set it in the future, and I set it in the future in a post-apocalyptic future where an isolated community has recreated itself, has found meaning and structure and hierarchies and systems of what we would identify as religious rituals. And they've found those in the entirely random books that happen to have survived into their village.
You know, I have not watched The Handmaid's Tale, though I do know of it.
Yep.
And what I was really intrigued by the Book of Air is, as you said, our lives revolve around this book, whatever it was, the sacred text. I believe it was Jane Eyre.
Yes.
I'm reminded, too, of, I don't know if you were an original fan of the Star Trek, the original series, TOS for our listeners. That's what all the Trekkies call it. There was an episode where aliens saved this pocket of humanity, and the only book that was there was this, we called them dime store novels.
Yeah.
And they built an entire society around a dime store novel that just repeated itself. What was the reaction to the Book of Air from your readers? I'm curious what their thoughts are, or for Besotted or The Male Gaze.
Well, let me come back to that. First, I just want to say about those examples you gave. So the Handmaid's Tale was published in 1986. And I happened to be teaching in America for 1 year. That was my first experience of California, 86, 87. And a student, following a tradition in the school, donated a copy of this novel, her choice, to the school library, dedicating it to me at the end of the year. She was graduating as her English teacher, right? So that was a thing they did. Students graduating could donate a book to the library in the name of a teacher that they had appreciated. This was the book she donated, The Handmaid's Tale, 1987, and I read it then. And I thought, I'm not a huge fan of science fiction. I have watched Star Trek over the years. I saw at least one movie, but I wouldn't call myself a fan. I don't do science fiction particularly, but I thought if ever the thought came into my head, and I hadn't written a novel yet, I thought if ever I came to write a novel set in the future, this is the kind of thing I'd like to write. So The Handmaid's Tale was just as an aspirational model, of how one might set about doing this. So it's an interesting connection. It was down there deep inside me as a sort of so the idea of a society which is functioning by new rules, new rituals, and so on, which The Handmaid's Tale does brilliantly. The dime store novel in Star Trek, that is typical of the brilliance of Star Trek. And I never saw that episode and didn't know it existed. But it is, of course, a forerunner for the Book of Air. The one I had in mind when I wrote it, I'd recently read a novel called The Book of Dave by a British author called Will Self. I struggled to get through it only because I was determined to learn from it. Personally, I don't rate it at all. But the basic premise is a taxi driver, a cab driver in London, has written a book and left it to his estranged son. And somehow this book becomes, in centuries in the future, gets turned into a Bible. And of course, it's full of, I don't know, of course, it's full of ridiculous prejudices and so on. Will Self does a rather unkind portrait of a typical London taxi driver, which a rather prejudicial account of who they are. But and I thought this is a brilliant idea, totally wasted. That was my view of it, and I thought I can do better than that. So very arrogantly, I said, and I want my text to be something that is interesting and substantial, and is not full of nonsense, and yet is not intended to be a guide for life. And so that's why I chose Jane Eyre. It didn't take me long to settle on Jane Eyre, by the way, because I wanted something that readers would at least have heard of or be conscious of. You don't have to have read Jane Eyre in order to read the Book of Eyre, but at least it's a novel. It's a classic novel. Everybody knows that. You might have seen a film of it. You might have a sense of it. You might know who Mr. Rochester is and so on. So, or that there's a mad woman in the attic. Just enough that. And the other thing I wanted was a novel that could be understood by a rural community, by people who are sustaining their life through farming. So a novel like Dickens set in London involving complicated bureaucratic institutions, that would make no sense to them. So I'll tell you some of the most interesting responses I got. It was very favorably reviewed by almost exclusively female reviewers. They valued it as the way they expressed it as a science fiction novel that had a kind of a very strong human dimension. One of my favorite reviewers came from a website called Druid Life, and the reviewer on Druid Life said, "I highly recommend this book to all pagans." I thought that's something, that's that I'd like that in big print on the front of the book.
I think that's going to be an epitaph on your tombstone someday.
Yes.
I love that. As you have progressed from your writing of novels, and perhaps you have more in the works, different stages, perhaps, you're also writing, as we had shared earlier, your memoir. You're working or dabbling in poetry and life writing. And first of all, I'm curious what life writing is. How do you define it? And maybe talk a little bit about this progression that you're taking in your work.
Yeah, certainly, yes. Life writing is just the word I've started using. I suppose I should call it a memoir. But I can't even say that. I can't even say that word without feeling I'm being slightly pretentious and French.
Well, that was actually something that was going through my head for the sake of, all honesty. Who writes their memoir these days? I know there's people out there. They've only been in the business for 10 years, and some actor somewhere is writing his memoir. Who knows? But I digress.
To put that in context, no, it's a good question, see, because, traditionally, the word for any of this, of course, would be autobiography. And if memoir is French, autobiography is Greek. That's even more pretentious. But that would be exactly the question about an autobiography. That's something you write after, well on into late middle age, before you lose your faculties, and typically about a life of achievement. So the memoir writing, ever since the 70s and 80s, really, it's sort of rooted in the new way of writing memoir, in the idea that all lives have value and all lives have meaning, and we want to hear a diversity of voices. So there has been a kind of a flourishing of memoir writing, often by writers in their 20s, who are essentially recording the eccentric or difficult circumstances of their childhoods and stories of survival. So there's that idea. And I've resisted until now writing anything about my childhood, is for precisely the reasons you suggest. I am not distinguished enough to write an autobiography, and I am not going to write a memoir about what a rotten childhood I had. This is what is sometimes being characterized as misery lit. So I can't do either of those things. So I've sort of put it off. But finally, I got launched into it as a sort of a conversation with my dead younger brother, who was 16 months younger than me, died 5 years ago, very sadly, and I was extremely close to him. I realized it was only as I became an adult that I realized that not many people are as closely bonded with a sibling as I was in an almost twin-like relationship, and so that sort of pushed me into writing it to sort of understand his life as well as my own, and that felt less egocentric, and that sort of gave me the freedom to do it. The interesting thing is that I've got quite a lot of experience of editing memoirs. Various people over the years have enlisted my help in writing things, and they've had people who've had dramatic lives, politically active lives. For example, a woman who was in the Southern civil rights movement in the 60s, lived through very dangerous personal times. I worked with her on a memoir, and somebody else active in radical 60s politics. I've sort of worked from the outside with other people's memoirs. So it's been very interesting for me, finally, to try and make a kind of coherent story of my own.
Very nice. And you mentioned it early on, an interest in poetry. How is that now taking shape for you?
Well, when we first went into lockdown in March of last year.
A year ago, yeah.
Yeah, a year ago. I for some reason, I felt the urge to do this. And it was a strange thing. It was a strange effect that lockdown had on me. I've said that I am completely at ease with, in theory at least, with how to write a novel. I mean, it's always a struggle and the results are always mixed. I do the best I can. But at least I know what a novel should be like. And I've always felt sort of slightly out of the swim with poetry, that I have the impulse to write it, but it's hard for me to get a readership. And when we went into lockdown, I suddenly felt liberated, as if I was cut adrift from the world. And I thought, well, now I can write poetry any way I like. It doesn't matter whether other people are going to enjoy it or appreciate it, or whether anybody is going to publish it in their poetry magazines. Now, that was a completely irrational response to lockdown, but it was a response. It was about the sense of being isolated, cut adrift. And so what I started doing was writing poems, not at all about myself, poems about famous paintings. And this was something I could do entirely through the internet. Find the painting on the internet, research it, go through that process that I call, I don't know if other people do, wiki hopping from one Wikipedia page to another. And so sort of digging into following up stories. And I would research a painting during the course of maybe a day. And then next day I'd write a poem about it. So my research was extremely shallow and specific, or, because it's not my field, history of art or anything. So it was a very interesting thing to do. And after we came out of lockdown, I'd written about 30 poems that I liked. And, I felt I'd learnt something about writing poetry that I didn't know before.
Well, I have to say, I am looking forward to that book of poetry when it gets published, because you said something that I find very intriguing, and others have exclaimed something similar. This COVID and this lockdown presented for people the opportunity to go inside, so to speak, and look at how can I continue to survive and live my life with some sense of purpose so that I don't go, for the sake of better words, stir crazy.
Yeah.
You went at it.
Yeah.
And you had a plan. Moving out here to Las Vegas, we have open sky, dark sky everywhere at night, almost blue skies over 300 days a year, beautiful stars. And I pursued photography, dark sky photography, taking pictures of the Milky Way.
Wow.
I know of a woman who essentially repainted her house, took up a new hobby. So there's lots of examples of where people use this really strange year to essentially kind of take a journey. Well, it's not a tangent, but it's a journey that goes beyond their normal, say, workday, and really to explore and better themselves. And I love the fact, and I love, your premise is to research these paintings. And in fact, even as you were saying that, many of the large museums around the world open themselves up virtually.
Yes, indeed. And that's been very helpful. And a lot of these poems I've written are, you might call them dramatic monologues. A character from the painting speaks, or the painter speaks. But very few of them are in my own voice. And that I find and I realized as I was doing that most of my novels are written as first-person narratives or combinations of first-person narratives. And that's where I'm most comfortable in a way, not speaking in my own voice. And I think it's one of the reasons that I like editing, that I'm actually quite happy to adopt the voice of the writer in trimming and shaping the work.
Mm. Before we start to come to the close of the podcast, I do want to talk about the editing work and the ability to help others edit their work or perhaps write their work, the ghost writing, so to speak. How are you continuing to evolve that area of your business? I would call that, by the way, Joe, a side hustle.
Yeah.
I developed a series within Success Insight podcast. We called it Side Hustle Saturday. So you had your day job, but your other job, which you did perhaps for pleasure, for your own specific interest, but you found you could make money at it. But I know you're editing, your copy editing, your writing, ghostwriting. That's not a side hustle. I mean, it's a very significant part of the work that you do. But talk a little bit more about that. And who are the folks that are coming to you for that type of assistance?
Well, because of the accidents of contacts, because it's people come to me typically through a sort of personal contact or some kind of one-to-one connection. A lot of them they're in business, or they're in the coaching or consulting world. A few times I have edited books for publishers at the request of the author, saying you're going to have an editor. Could you pass it on to this person? That's happened with a couple of books. And there is a range of things that I find myself doing. And it's very negotiated, really, with the writer, because at the one end, there's just the sort of the light editing, typically where you wouldn't make any changes to the manuscript without tracking them and discussing them. But just, you might tidy up the punctuation, you might clarify some sentences, you reorganize things a bit, and you offer that as a sort of a proposed change. And at the other extreme, of course, you mentioned ghost writing. I have done a bit of I've never done the kind of the full-on ghostwriting thing where you interview the celebrity author, in inverted commas, and write the book from scratch. but ghostwriting where the writing is is in such a mess that you need to just take a free hand with it and say, do you mind if I just have another go at expressing what you've expressed here? And then you just sort of take a free hand with it. So it's a range of things. What some of my happiest experiences have been with non-English speakers, one from China, one from France, and one from Italy. So, for example, the Italian writer was a very successful businesswoman in Italy who'd written a book in Italian about her ideas about business and how to be successful in business. And then she had translated it herself into English. So legitimately, it was because she was not by any means she certainly wasn't a native speaker of English, nor a particularly fluent speaker in English, but she translated it, and it needed a lot of work. And she said, just fix it up, do what you need to do with it. And that was wonderful. And I don't speak Italian, so I was reading that with an Italian dictionary on my desk, because there were times when I thought, I don't quite get what she's trying to say, and I've got a feeling this is badly translated from the Italian, and I would be looking up words in the Italian. So I got sort of a bit of an education of linguistically along the way. But that's fun, having a project like that, where the writer is doing something really substantial, has something interesting to say, and genuinely and legitimately needs help expressing it.
Fantastic. Well, you're a busy man, I have no doubt, between the memoir, the poetry, taking on the tasks of editing and writing services. And as to share with our listeners, you were mentioning you were spending some perhaps distance time with your grandson over the weekend. So you and Lenny are enjoying that, no doubt. It sounds like your days are pretty full with these projects.
Yes, they are.
Fantastic. Joe, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, I've got a website where there are highlights of reviews, information on my novels, www.joetreasure.com. And I write an occasional blog where I have extensive, over the years, an accumulation of thoughts on various political, social, literary topics, which is joetreasure.blogspot.com.
Fantastic. Well, we will most definitely provide backlinks for our audience to your website, joetreasure.com, as well as a link to the blog at joetreasure.blogspot.com. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Success Insight Podcast and really to learn more about your journey. It's quite amazing, and I most definitely am looking forward to your book of poetry and of course, the memoir as well. So thank you again for taking time out of your busy day.
Well, thank you, Howard. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Joe Treasure. He is a fiction writer, a novelist, currently writing his memoir. He has a book of poetry in the works, and what a fascinating story there. And Joe's also a freelance editor, a writing coach, and I tell you what, just given everything we've chatted about today, if you need help with your writing, if you have a book in you, I think I would most definitely want to have Joe at least, perhaps some mentoring, some coaching along the way, because very talented. And again, his wonderful novels, The Male Gaze, Besotted, and The Book of Air, definitely encourage you to check those out on Amazon. We'll provide some links back to the Amazon page for his 3 novels. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Don't forget to take care of yourselves, take care of your family, practice social distancing. We'll get through this COVID adventure together. Do let us know your thoughts on our podcast at successinsightpodcast.com. We are also on LinkedIn and Facebook on our Success Insight Podcast pages. And you can also listen to this episode on the major podcasting platforms. Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and you can also find us on YouTube. Okay, folks, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.